I am the board president of a super scrappy nonprofit in Massachusetts called Class Action that invites dialogue and engagement around class dynamics. And then when I am not board president, trainer, and the like in that space, I am also a consultant with a DC-based diversity inclusion firm called Cook Ross. So as you can imagine, I have these conversations quite a lot. And then Karen and I are friends and colleagues in the work. So when I thought of who to talk to about this, I figure, why not just reach out to Karen? So I'm super excited for Karen for creating this platform, making the space, and for all of you registering. So here's how you all can connect with us on the interwebs, particularly Twitter. And we definitely wanted to, before we even start the conversation and dive in deep, we do want to ground this conversation in a reflection on the lives that are lost, because we should never forget that part of what's so profound about these conversations is that we're having these conversations in an effort to end systemic violence and the disproportionate violence that is impacting Black people, particularly Black women. And when we also think of this recent verdict, or lack thereof, the decision and announcement about Breonna Taylor, we want to have a moment of silence for 26 seconds to sort of just mark that.
Say her name, Breonna Taylor.
Thank you. So here's a quick agenda to frame our conversation. So we're actually going to do a timeline and media analysis to figure out, well, how did we get here in the first place? And then we're going to review some terms, because what I find interesting, and others might share this, is that there is so much being conflated in some of the messaging coming from the Trump administration that it's profoundly clear that they do not understand where critical race theory, anti-racism, diversity inclusion training, white privilege start, end, and overlap. So we're definitely going to get clear on terms, and then Karen and I are just going to have a conversation about what's been coming up for us, where do we think, what we're nervous about, what we're hopeful about, and where we think, you know, the work needs to go. And then we're going to close out with some takeaways. So this is going to be a jam-packed session. So because we're going to make sure to end on time. So next up, how did we get here? So I'm sure many people have seen this headline from the Washington Post where, you know, the administration is directing all federal agencies to cancel race-related training sessions and calling them, quote unquote, un-American propaganda. So, but before we can even, it did not start here, although this is the one that probably garnered a significant amount of attention. This actually goes farther back, not just in history, but all the way back in July. So next slide. So in July, Christopher Rufo, who is a journalist and a conservative activist, published this article in the New York Post called "The Obscene Federal Diversity Training Scam Prospers Even Under the Trump Administration." And what he was trying to draw attention to was that conversations around bias, diversity, and inclusion, and particularly conversations that challenged institutional racism and white privilege, were even happening in the midst of the Trump administration. What was fascinating about the article is it was a direct attack on actually the founder of the firm where I work, Cook Ross, Howard Ross, and the work that he had done with one of the government agencies. And what's also fascinating about this article that wasn't actually available at the time, because of note, is that this is an opinion piece. So this is not like gold standard journalism where all parties are reached out to and all perspectives are represented. This was this journalist's take on the matter. So what actually happened was that there was a town hall that was hosted by a government agency featuring not only Howard Ross, who's been a longtime social justice activist, but also Dr. Janetta Besh-Cole, who many of us know and love as sort of from the former president of both Bennett College and then also Spelman, So she's a sort of luminary and sort of elder in sort of fighting for social justice for many of us. So this was wildly misrepresented. So this is in July. Fast forward to September, where Chris Rufo appears on the president's favorite channel, Fox News, with Tucker Carlson, and talks about how critical race theory is an indoctrination method that is taking place in the federal government, and directly asks Trump to eliminate all of those training programs that explore that topic, have conversations about white privilege and the like. So then, consequently, we see all of these orders. Here's a memo. One is a memo that came from the Office of Management and Budget, calling on all the agencies to review their contracts around diversity training. And then we see it once again getting sort of news headlines. And then just this past week alone, we see an executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping, which I'm not sure if anybody has read it, but offline, I can share my annotated version with you on all my thoughts.
Well, and as I shared with Shane, this executive order is literally straight out of 1984. Like, it is 100% lies and doublespeak. Because who it is saying that we end race and sex stereotyping of is white men. That's who it's.
So then next up, finally, so remember, if we're tracking this conversation started in July, and it's not until September 18th that someone finally decides to say, well, wait a minute, who is the person that spurred all of the quote unquote spurred all of this? And then we see in this article that they're finally talking about what actually happened in that event that Chris Rufo, the journalist, did not participate in, but had learned about from a whistleblower. And in this particular article, finally, a journalist brings in Howard's voice, and Howard clarifies that one, it actually was not even a training. It was a keynote that was attended by 9,000 people. And a town hall rather, that he and Dr. Cole have done with lots of different organizations to help them make meaning of what we've been seeing over the past 6 months, develop a shared vocabulary, and then also role model and set the context for people to have critical conversations, not just about social events and what we're seeing in the news, but also about how this relates to the workplace, and more importantly, connecting all of what's happening to both a personal and historically situated lens. So when we get more of this information, we realize that what we're seeing is an incredible and powerful distortion campaign. Next step. Now, and then recently an article said, well, did Trump further diversity and anti-racism training? Which is an interesting question, because we know that he is attacking particular terms that he is conflating, but that does not mean that it's an outright sort of end to all of this training, which is why I think the conversation around clarifying what's the difference between bias trainings, diversity trainings, even some of the efforts going on in communities and corporations, and how does it actually intersect or relate to critical race theory and then anti-racism efforts broadly. So next up, an important sort of frame of reference is that history is important more than any other topic. It is about us. Whether one deems our present society wondrous or awful or both, history reveals how we got to this point. So this quote is offered by James Lowen, who's the author of Lies My Teacher Told Me. Because the confrontation that we're in the midst of, before we even get to the conflation of terms, is fundamentally about two things. One, with history, that offers us a shared sort of context to understand whether activism or any pursuit is radical or actually appropriate when we think about terms of historical redress. Additionally, what we also have to acknowledge is that the history of the United States is also profoundly whitewashed. So the history doesn't even adequately reflect, one, the full breadth and diversity of people who have contributed to the shaping of this project called democracy or the United States. And when we think about the people who could have the power to control the narratives and stories around history, it becomes incredibly important for us to actually dig a little bit deeper. And when we dig a little bit deeper, we realize that the conversation that's happening right now, Trump is pulling from an ancient playbook, a playbook that was started by, next slide, a group of elite white women. A group of elite white women organized under the organization called the Daughters of the Confederacy, who after the Civil War decided that they wanted to make sure to memorialize and set the context for how we understood slavery as an institution and its impact in the racialized legacy of the United States to this very present day. And I'm sure many of us have seen in the news that there are Confederate statues that are falling. Another interesting point too about the Daughters of the Confederacy is that a lot of these statues were not just put up right at the sort of end of the Civil War. Many of these statues started getting put up between the early 1900s all the way up to the 1930s. And part of the reason that the Daughters of Confederacy chose to do that is because they wanted to memorialize and institutionalize the history of the heroes of the Confederacy. But that was just the cherry on top of the cake. The cake, their bread and butter, what they were trying to do in their efforts was actually to fundamentally change education as we know it to ensure that history across the United States did not actually adequately reflect and represent both the horror of slavery and even sort of what happened with regard to civil rights. It's not by accident that most of what we know and are educated on in our schools is the I Have a Dream speech and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King just non-violently protested without adequate mentioning of, well, if many of our civil rights icons are sort of passing recently when we think of the passing of Congressman John Lewis, it's not that when civil rights was won, partially, that all of a sudden all of the people with racist ideas all of a sudden evaporated and went away. They are still quite with us. And they're also quite good at transmitting their ideology. So,
if I may, Shane, I would just add that this time period, the 1910s to 1930s, coincides with the national expansion of the Ku Klux Klan post the movie Birth of a Nation.
Mm-hmm.
So before Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan was largely just ex-Confederate soldiers living in the South. After Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan spreads all across the country to 39 different states. It's particularly popular in small cities like Denver, Colorado, Portland, Oregon, Portland, Maine. It becomes like the thing to join. And it coincides with the 19th Amendment, women getting the right to vote, white women getting the right to vote. And so they create a women's Ku Klux Klan auxiliary. Mm-hmm. And the grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, who was a retired dentist from Dallas, Texas, he decides that he wants to make the Ku Klux Klan into a mainstream political organization. And the greatest thing that they're going to target is public school curriculum. So this also coincides with the advent of universal public education and the establishment of school boards, public schools, etc. And so the Ku Klux Klan views the public school curriculum as the greatest tool for indoctrinating young minds into the Ku Klux Klan's belief system. Women of the Klan, yes, thank you, Amanda. Women of the Klan, that book everyone needs to read that book about this period of history of the creation of the women's Ku Klux Klan.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So that's important. So now imagine, so I think also the throughput that we also want to make sure to connect with as well is that racism, and we'll talk about this certainly with CRT, racism has been a sort of profound and central part of the construction of the United States. And when we think about the access that the Daughters of the Confederacy had to the President of the United States, to wealth derived from enslaved Africans and forced labor, what this also reminds us of is that the conversation we have to apply both a race analysis and a class analysis. And when we wed those two together, we see some very, very, very profound and powerful themes that are worth our attention. So next up, so here we see this supposedly marginal group that's so quiet and just, socialites hanging out, having tea, which is not true. And then we actually see their profound impact. So the Southern Poverty Law Center issued a report in 2018 called Teaching Hard History, and they had analyzed all of these different school curricula across the United States, not just the South. And what they found is across the board, most schools poorly teach the realities of both slavery, civil rights, and other difficult and painful aspects of United States history. And the impact of that is what we're seeing today. When we have to convince people about why we have to be out in the streets, why we need to continue the goals of civil rights, why it wasn't enough, part of that isn't just the present day misinformation campaign, it's also about the history that we were working with from the very beginning. And as someone who likes to think and talk and sort of activate and agitate, I think of if we all had common language and a common and powerful understanding of history, think of all the things that we would be able to think about once we have really sort of won these fights, as opposed to sort of being in a sort of perennial hamster wheel of sorts of fighting this ongoing battle.
Every generation fighting the same battle.
Mm-hmm. And next slide. I think of this very, very powerful quote from Joe Fagan, who is a sociologist, and he says this: over more than 4 decades of teaching experience with thousands of students, I have found that until whites have substantial instruction in the history and contemporary reality of racial oppression, most reject important understandings and interpretations they need to be supportive of major changes in our racist system. And because of space, he goes on to continue to say that most people in the United States haven't even had a basic racism 101 or stereotyping 101 course in kindergarten, middle school, high school, college, or graduate school. And that fundamentally impacts everybody's knowledge of both our painful history and its connection to present day realities. So despite that we're having around the sort of shaping of history, the context in which we understand things is not only a long-standing battle, but it is also a very, very powerful tool within Trump's campaign, because honest, accurate histories not only help us understand how far we need to go to sort of win, quote unquote, but also helps us see many white anti-racists who have been sort of very powerful models of advocating for justice, but then also the breadth of people of color who continue to be the conscience of this nation and sort of really crafting a nation that truly meets the ideals that the administration professes are already in existence when they're no. These are aspirations, we have not gotten there yet.
Yes, if I may, I'd like to read a quote from the executive order this week banning gender and racial stereotyping.
Sure.
This is a direct quote. Our founding documents rejected these racialized views of America, which were soundly defeated on the blood-stained battlefields of the Civil War. So what founding documents is he referring to? Because I'm gonna read a quote and I want you to put in the chat what founding document is this quote from. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Does anyone know which of our founding documents is that a quote from? Yes, thank you, Haley. It is the Declaration of Independence. The same document that starts off, all men are created equal, but of course they're only talking about white property owning, enslaved people owning men, right? Who are also Protestants. And I'm going to read another quote, and I want you to tell me which of our founding documents this is from. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of 3 persons including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. What founding document is that from? The Constitution, yes. This is Article 1, Section 2 of the US Constitution. And although the 14th, 15th, 16th Amendments overwrites this part of the Constitution, it's still there. If you open it up, it's not as if, you know, it's not like a Wikipedia entry where they delete it or say that that was wrong. And the mental construct of 3/5 is still there because we know in 2019, Black women earn 62 cents for every dollar that a white man earns. So I apologize. I just had to add that in there.
Oh, no. And speaking of, there's also a personal connection to what you've just shared too, because my niece, who is 15-year-old, last year, I had to go to her school in Maryland because her teacher was having trouble educating them on the 3/5 compromise. So she decided to have them pretend to be enslaved people so that way she could illustrate the lesson. Yes, it is okay to, yeah, it was absolutely outrageous. And what I had to share with her, she was like, they didn't understand the fraction. And I said, first of all, kids can comprehend fractions. It's not unclear what 3/5 means. What they probably struggle to understand is how full human beings at any point today, or even in history, could be considered less than fully human beings. So the fact that they were struggling to comprehend that is actually a good thing. We had much more stronger words after that, but that's a whole other webinar.
And Christopher Carr in the chat is saying, in addition, with the pipeline to prison aspect, we lose 3/5 of Black men to the prison industrial complex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these ideas, these racist ideas, thinking of the work of Ibram Kendi, they don't die quickly, they don't die easily. They continue to have sort of reverberations to this day on top of the lasting legacies of sort of racist oppression in the past. Mm-hmm. And then someone sharing, a few years back in my district in New Jersey, I had a teacher who held a mock slave auction to illustrate slavery.
We had those when I was in junior high school as a fundraiser. This was something we did on an annual basis in my junior high school. No one thought anything was problematic about it.
And these are sort of these historical distortions are not just even in slavery, because I think just last week, the New York Times published an article about how some very sizable percentage of young people, all the way up to people in their 30s, don't even know that 6 million Jews were killed, among others, in the Holocaust. Like that is going to sort of be very, very dangerous in the future if people do not understand these sort of significant examples of grotesque human rights abuses.
And I would just add, someone saying that any reference to the 3/5 compromise should not be in the Constitution of today. What a shame. Not only is it in the Constitution of today, it was used to apportion seats in the House of Representatives. And the way that electoral college votes are determined is by adding the number of senators to the number of representatives. And so it continues to impact on our politics today that states with tiny populations are overrepresented in their electoral college impact. And states with large populations, like my state, California, have diminished influence in national elections because, you know, we have 2 senators representing 39 million people.
Yep. So next up, but history, part of why we have this attack is because history is in fact a weapon. And what's cool actually about this title is this 8 stages of the process of social movement success. This was actually developed by an activist and educator who has since passed on, Bill Moyer. And in this article that he wrote in 1997, he sort of frames this stages of success because we are in a profoundly difficult time right now. We just recently received the announcement about Breonna Taylor. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has recently passed away. We lost John Lewis, among others, and now we're seeing these sort of widespread attacks from the Trump administration on sort of diversity and inclusion trainings, particularly in the federal government. At the same time, we're also seeing elite institutions be attacked. Department of Education is investigating Yale University for allegedly discriminating against white people and Asian people. Princeton University, the president of the university said, you know, systemic racism also plays a role in the sort of institution to this very day. And now Princeton is also being investigated, which is pretty powerful because who would imagine that the Ivy that was described as the sort of Ivy of the South would in fact have ever admitted publicly at the highest levels of the institution that they have also sort of systemic racism exists there as well.
And there's been a grassroots war for a while now against Black academics by their own students, people coming in and writing, you know, using online systems to give horrible reviews, leaving them death threats. Like there's been this huge attempt to silence and diminish the impact of our most gifted scholars.
Right. And then what you'll notice here is that, so part of why I think it's important for us to understand history, because history provides us with the context, and then connected to history is a framework to help us make meaning of what's going on. So part of what I like about this 8 stages of social movement is we never know, everything seems quite sort of uncertain, but actually, according to Bill Moyer, there is a sort of life to movements. So what I think we're in is actually, what we're in right now as a moment is a sign that we're making some serious progress, because we already had the watershed moments known as trigger events in May. And then we saw profound activism, not just here in the United States, but all across the globe. And now we're in a period where we're approaching the election and everything seems more dire than ever. But as you can see from this social process, that is also right before there's a profound shift in majority opinion that sort of undermines the power structure as we understand it today. So I think that this, although there's lots of reasons to not be hopeful, I think that this model in some ways provides just a little bit of comfort, because as we've seen from history, there are profound opportunities to continue to sort of maintain momentum. And someone sharing that I agree that this year has been phenomenal. We have a ways to go, but the global activism is really, really awesome. Seeing people speak truth to power, seeing people sort of use similar terms. And I see that there is a YouTube link that's been dropped in. I won't click it just yet, but thank you all for sharing these resources.
I was so inspired this summer to see Americans of all ages, races, genders unite behind young Black people in the streets, and to see those young Black people with the megaphones, and many of them, it was like their first time out there protesting. And you know, to see it happen in all 50 states, to see it happen, so many acts of solidarity, again, across all different racial and ethnic groups, I just was so inspired. But at the same time, I knew that if we think these folks are going to relinquish their power without some kind of tremendous backlash, we are sorely mistaken. And now we're in this period of backlash. And it's very dismaying to me to see the decline in white people who, you know, in June were fervently expressing support for anti-racism, now to see that waver and diminish, which is also totally predictable. So I just want to say to everybody out there, please don't waver. Now is not the time to waver. Now is the time to turn up the volume on those demands. And what I've said for a while is that this period reminds me of the last 10 years before the Civil War, when the slave owners could feel it slipping away. And so they were doing everything they could to clutch onto their power. And they were becoming increasingly violent, like the Fugitive Slave Act, Dred Scott, et cetera, et cetera. And the abolitionists just had to stay the course and not fear that they were losing, but to really stay the course and continue the political education of the people in the North until they were willing to give up their lives to defeat slavery. Now, I hope that we don't have to go to a civil war in order to transform our society, but we have to keep this political education going. So I'm so grateful to you for sharing all of this.
Yeah, it's really, really powerful because oftentimes absent, if we just sort of went with what's going on today without this broader view and sort of historical context, we could easily sort of be disheartened and just throw in our hat. But to imagine that some of what we're experiencing right now is sort of, in step with the desire, the people who are elite power holders to say like, okay, how do we discourage them as quickly as possible? How do we sort of put all of our might to kind of pushing them back when actually their reactivity is the cue that we are really making some profound momentum until we deliver that deadly blow. Okay, next up.
Sorry.
No worries.
Okay.
Because, and sort of tying this all together, slide design, not my expertise, everybody, but we'll get it. So history offers us context. That's why we want it to be sort of nuanced, complex, to give us both role modeling and a sense of how has this happened before? There have been so many movements within the United States that we're not even adequately well educated around. So we have to be in this consistent process of becoming more historically literate and really seeking out those hidden histories that we wouldn't get through our formal education until we start paying very close attention to sort of school board elections, curriculum development. We really need to be involved in our local politics and sort of wield a lot more power on the school boards, the textbook publishers and the like to ensure that 30 years from now, this movement is well sort of reflected and not some, oh, Black Lives Matter started and then we gained all these rights. And then 40 years later, people are like, oh, there's a BLM movement, but we still have so many more ways to go. So history gives us context, but then in order to sort of really do sort of an anti-oppression or an anti-racist practice effectively, we need history. We also need a framework by which to understand social structure because those two help inform action, whether it's individual or structural, which brings us to the conflation and sort of the conversation around critical race theory as a framework. So next up, so lots of terms are being thrown around right now. And I know from working in the diversity and inclusion space, people are now talking about anti-racism. Many organizations may not even fully understand what it actually takes to be an anti-racist organization. So we need to actually define this very, very clearly so people can fully understand what the stakes of the game are. And how do we relate this to prior messaging that we received, particularly around the colorblind philosophy, a very powerful and pervasive philosophy that also connects to our sort of understanding or misunderstanding of history rather, because colorblindness says, no, we don't see race, but we also don't see the ugly grisly history about how race has been handled or mishandled in the United States, or how race might be different than racism as a sort of system and a structure. So all of that sort of lack of nuance and that flattening has profound impact to today. So what we're going to do very quickly in the time that we have is talk about critical race theory, white privilege, diversity training, anti-racism. The next up, first, I think it's critically important to put a face, or faces rather, to critical race theory. So we've got Derek Bell. Many people know Kimberly Crenshaw, particularly for her work on intersectionality. We've got Patricia Williams, Mari Matsuda, Richard Delgado, and then one of my personal favorites, Kamar Phyllis-Jones, who is a sort of rock star in the world of public health for thinking about social determinants of health and not just tracking rates of mortality and morbidity, but also tracking health disparities and situating them very critically and importantly within a historical context. So two things I want to highlight with this slide is when we think of the complex multicultural history of the United States and the thinkers and scholars who've contributed to creating critical race theory, look at this. This is pretty profound. Who is represented in shaping this very, very powerful framework that offers an incredible, yes, they are diverse faces of the United States. So we have to acknowledge that in the sense that it's interesting that they have decided to sort of challenge critical race theory, both because of the diversity of the scholars, but critical race theory as a lens being profoundly antithetical, but then also a serious challenge to white power structure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they represent the US. So next up, some basic sort of premises of CRT, and we see in some ways, well, let me read through them first. So racism is ordinary, commonplace, and everyday. Racism is not marginal to the United States, it is central to the United States identity, which also lifts up much of the work that Nicole Hannah-Jones is doing around the 1619 Project. And she's not doing anything new necessarily, as much as providing a new and critical framing for how we need to understand the United States. And let's also be clear that Nicole Hannah-Jones being a Black woman, we should understand that part of the virulence that the Trump administration is directing towards her isn't just because of the content, but also misogynoir. And then so we see racism serves the interests of both white people in power, the elites materially, and working class white people psychically, and therefore neither group has much incentive to fight it. So this even relates to what Derek Bell used to talk about with interest conversion, in the sense that Black people will gain rights to the extent that winning their rights aligns with the interests of white people. So we really have to think about what kind of analysis, messaging, and framework ensures that everybody understands the profoundly deleterious dynamics of racism, and how even as you might be receiving material privilege, particularly for the white elites, that is of no benefit to people who are chronically impoverished and of the working class across racial groups, and especially for white people who are impoverished.
Yes, now, I highly recommend Dying of Whiteness to learn about that in contemporary context.
And then it also speaks to some of the power of racism is that it also hides the fact that oftentimes when you think of the strong association of Black people who are impoverished, and yes, there's a disproportionate number of Black people who are poor, but numerically speaking, there are more poor whites. So in liberating all people across sort of race, class, and other markers of social identity oppression, everybody gets to secure their liberation, and not just psychically.
Similarly, there's a disproportionate number of Black people killed by police, and particularly unarmed Black people killed by police, but the numerical majority of people killed by police are white people.
Yeah, thank you. So someone's asking, can you say more about racism is ordinary? So what we mean by racism is ordinary is the sense that racism is so deeply normalized such that it is invisible. We don't even feel like it's abnormal. Now, certainly if we are the people who are the sort of recipients of the disproportionate violence and inequity, we feel its salience. But for those who are not targeted by racism, this is just barely perceivable. So that's what they mean by sort of racism is ordinary. Next up, race and races are social and political constructs, categories that society invents and manipulates when convenient. So part of our miseducation around history is completely forgetting how Irish, Italians, Jewish people, and Polish people were not welcomed with open arms in the United States. They had a particular sort of history that eventually landed them in the place of whiteness, but they did not start their journey there. So when we look at these histories in a sort of really complex and nuanced way, we begin to understand that there is some very, very powerful machinery that's happening. And then society chooses to ignore this and assigns characteristics to whole groups of people in order to advance the idea of race and the superiority of whiteness. And the power that whiteness wields to sort of shape and craft narrative. So for example, when we think of the model minority myth, it is not by accident that the model minority myth was constructed right around the time of civil rights and the Black Panther Party as a vehicle to undermine sort of the Black liberation struggle. And when we forget that origin story, we might just assume, oh, the model minority myth is just like the state of affairs, as opposed to a byproduct of racial capitalism. And then lastly, the power elite racializes different groups at different times to achieve their economic agenda, continually and repeatedly prioritizing profit over people. So this even captures why it's so critically important for us to have both a race and class analysis, because we might miss certain things if we do not sort of think. I think of one powerful example, Karen, when we were thinking about the Reopen the Economy campaign, and people were talking about how are all these white people able to get away with yelling and cursing at the police officers without punishment? And I said, yes, if we think about it along the lines of racism, they're getting away with some real serious white privilege. But if we think about it along the lines of class, it illustrates that police are there to serve white elites, not everybody else. So they may not kill them quickly, but that also is a dynamic that we have to sort of name, lift up, and figure out how do we use that to our advantage as a wedge to sort of challenge these systems in a sort of intersectional way. Next up. Oh, if everybody could make sure they're muted.
That's probably me. Apologies.
Oh, okay, no worries. So then to speak about privilege, I like this quote from Shannon Sullivan's Good White People. The daily racial privileges that white people generally enjoy with respect to the police force, the prison system, and their educational, housing, and political rights as non-felons are different only in degree, not kind, from the daily racial privileges that slaveholders enjoyed 200 years ago. And attempting to distance oneself from white slaveholders as if they were completely different from white people today is to attempt to cover over the ways that the lives and habits of contemporary white people and white slaveholders are similar. So we have to put that in conversation with the quote unquote founding fathers of the United States. We have to put this in conversation with the people who would say, oh, racism is only something that poor white people do, or the sort of white ancestors of the past. No, once again, bringing it back to sort of the framework of critical race theory and what it's trying to sort of lift up as a sort of through point is that racism is central to the organization of our society. And in order to dismantle racism, we have to see it for what it is, not marginal, but in fact central. What does it mean if racist ideas can occupy the highest seat in the United States? What does it mean if elite white people of today are only different in degree, but not kind, as the elite white people of the past? Those are profound ideas.
And it shows up in Central Park in Amy Cooper picking up the phone to call NYPD on Christian Cooper for having the audacity to ask her to leash her dog when there's signs all over the place that say dogs must be leashed.
Yeah. Oh, and then I want to make sure to capture in the chat. Oh, I also noticed it was a choice for them to come here. They weren't stolen and brought here. Major difference there. Then they were welcomed into white spaces to which we never were. Very, very important to think about. We must understand our different sort of histories of sort of movement, immigration and enslavement, and the sort of differences and the overlaps within this larger sort of system of racism and white supremacy. So thank you for raising that up, Sammy.
I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of my own family and how my middle class privilege comes from genocide and land theft of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa people who, their traditional territory was land that was allocated to my great grandfather, who got off the boat from France, made his way to Western Nebraska, and acquired 360 acres of land through the Homestead Act, for which he paid $60 in the 1880s. And you think about, how many Black people were stuck sharecropping on the lands where their forebears had been enslaved and could not move, if they tried to do anything, they would be lynched or raped. And yet my great grandfather, who doesn't have any connection to this country whatsoever, is able to acquire this huge asset that then leads to my becoming a middle class homeowner and college graduate.
Right. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Such deep conversation. So then we get to all of the terms that are being sort of engaged in these present days. And those of us who've been doing the work are familiar with these terms, but many people who are hearing it may not even know the difference. So we have some definitions here around diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. All of these definitions are from the Racial Equity Tools glossary. So feel free to check those out. I actually like some of these definitions. I think they're particularly useful. But one of the things I actually want to highlight is that we also have to consider the history of diversity and inclusion as an industry and how it started in compliance after the introduction of anti-discrimination laws following civil rights, and then transformed to sort of racial sensitivity training or cultural sensitivity training. And now we see it in its present day iteration around sort of unconscious bias or implicit bias, which people have also found through research, social psychologists have found that when we label bias in the sort of standpoint of implicit, what happens is that people are then not actually held accountable because they have the sort of get out of jail free card of I never intended it, I never meant it, which is profound when we think about sort of EEOC complaints. In order to win an EEOC complaint, you actually have to prove intention, not impact. So when we think about some of these terms, we have to determine, are these terms used as sort of tools to get us through the door, or are they tools that may not adequately reflect or in some ways limit us in the work that we have to do? So getting to sort of anti-racism and how so many organizations are talking about it, in a recent conversation I had with a client about sort of, well, they were like, Shane, what do you think about race equity versus sort of anti-racism? And I said, it's really important for you to think about what's within, what is reasonable for you to do? Because when it comes to anti-racism, some organizations can do it really easily by just ceasing to exist, like just stop existing and return the land to the native and indigenous people. Others actually have to go through some profound culture change. And what I oftentimes share is going back to like colorblindness or even racial equity, those are two goals, but those are not the same things as the process by which to achieve them. And the outcomes have to be not just sort of any outcome that an organization tracks, but also outcomes situated in history. So one example I think of is Institute for Policy Studies calculated that it's going to take 228 years to close the racial wealth gap between Blacks and whites. When you hear that it's going to take 228 years, you realize that that is not just sort of family structure, that is not just having high incomes. That's going to require some profound societal level intervention among the most powerful institutions and industries that exist.
And I would point out, Shane, that was prior to 2020,
right,
prior to COVID, prior to this economic downturn that has disproportionately impacted Black and Brown people.
Mm-hmm. And what to also illustrate, like, how do we make sure that organizations are doing this work, are actually having measures that they track, but also putting them in context of history. So next up, what I think is really important is for when we think about anti-racism, what many organizations seem to miss, and I'll make sure to talk to this, is that anti-racism is not just stopping systemic sort of violence and denial of opportunity to Black people or other underrepresented and marginalized people. It is also using the system to stop increasing unearned advantages to people from privileged backgrounds. And that is when people really get in fisticuffs.
Yes.
Because most people will agree that people should not have to suffer violence or inequities and opportunities just because of their identity. Most people disagree on why would I have to sacrifice and why would you take my choice to sacrifice? Shouldn't I be able to volunteer or engage in philanthropy so that way it's my choice what power I let go of?
Exactly. This is how racial inequality is perpetuated by white people seeking what's best for my child. And all of the private choices that go into this, and this supreme desire to not relinquish any of our power or resources.
Mm-hmm. Precisely. So we have had a lot of conversation and we have 3 minutes left. And I'm sorry weren't able to get to questions, but feel free to put questions in the chat so that we can try and get to them quickly. But what do? Well, we need to share these rich and nuanced histories and sort of help people sort of get the right information to understand the context of our actions. But then we also need to really be accountable for continuing to build interethnic coalitions. We all need to be politically engaged. And then we also need to vote and agitate. So those are my quick and dirty tips, everybody.
Yes, and I would just add, right now, Trump is trying to demoralize us. He is trying to weaken our resolve. He's trying to make it seem inevitable that our vote won't matter because he's going to steal the election and it's all going to be, this long process. Don't get sucked into it. Don't get sucked into the hopelessness. This is the time for us to turn out en masse. And what else is inspiring me, you know, I was one of those women disrupting the Kavanaugh confirmation. And when we first started, there was just like a handful of us. And then each time we went back, there were more and more of us, and they were younger and younger. And then we showed up in 2018 and changed the margin of victory in the House of Representatives by the widest amount that's ever been done in a midterm election. So folks, please don't get demoralized. Stay in this fight. Vote. Make sure everyone you know is going to vote. And the greatest swing voter in this election is not the white moderate. The greatest swing voter is the person who feels opposed to Trump, but does not feel like their vote matters, or has never voted before, or you know, is just kind of depressed. So reach out to those people and get them to come out. And trust me, I'm gonna keep pounding on my white women. If white women vote the same way we did in 2016, oh my God, I don't know what I'm gonna, white women are canceled. But thank you all so much for joining us. I see people want to know who the attendees were, so maybe we can figure that out. I can save the chat. I think I will save the chat, so so we can share this information with everybody. Thank you all. Thank you, Shane. I love collaborating with you. You are such an amazing scholar and just human being. I'm so grateful.
Grateful to you as well. Thanks, everybody, and be in touch.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. Okay, so now let's see. Here we go. What?
You haven't seen my glasses, have you?
Yeah, and voting is not the only way we can do it, but that's one of the ways.
Yes, exactly. I know voting is not enough. We got to get in the streets too. And also, not everybody believes in voting. I just happen to be an activist who does believe in electoral politics, but respect for all activists and all the different methods of seeking change. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes, the recording and slide deck will be shared with the registrants.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Shane. And I'm going to have to bounce to another call.
Okay.
I'm just trying to figure out how I stop. Let's see. Stop share.
Oh, I like that quote. Thanks, Zara.
Okay. And then I'm going to stop the recording. Stop cloud recording.